Once there was a sister, like a glimmer of dawn in a girl's tragic fate. The girl was willing to sacrifice everything for her sister until the last moment of life. Imprisoned in the dungeon, Sienna looked at her sister's smug smile and realized, in horror, that the person who had always cared for her actually hated her to the core. All along, Lorena had wanted to take her life because Sienna had no magical power. Sienna, the vile, useless adopted child, had always been coldly treated and discriminated against by her family. Her adoptive father, the Duke, constantly criticized her as worthless, and her brothers wanted her gone. Everyone despised her. Lorena, Sienna's older sister, was a genius, loved by all. She was the only one who had ever shown Sienna any care, but innocent Sienna had no idea that it was all an act. Lorena had been using her as a scapegoat, blaming her for every sin she committed. Now, after being imprisoned by the Duke for 4 years, Sienna saw through Lorena's cruel nature. Desperate, Sienna pulled out a bottle of poison she had hidden and drank it all, hoping to end her suffering. But Lorena couldn't let her die so easily. Sienna had to endure all the torture. Separated and locked away, Sienna silently closed her eyes in pain, ready for her life, unloved by anyone, to finally come to an end by her own hand. But fate had other plans. When she opened her eyes, Sienna found herself back in time, before it all began. She was once again at Kendall Orphanage, where it all started. Today was the day the Duke of Natur would come to choose a child. All the orphans gathered, knowing that only those with magical potential would be selected by the nobility. Sienna and Lorena were not biological sisters. Both were adopted by the powerful Natur family. Even though Sienna had been brought into a noble household, she showed no magical talent, standing in stark contrast to Lorena, the girl genius admired by everyone. Sienna had always been a burden, despised by everyone. But this time, with memories of her tragic past life, Sienna was determined not to make the same mistake again. In her previous life, she had accidentally fallen in front of the Duke and caught his attention, something she intended to avoid at all costs this time. She would move carefully and avoid him. The Duke of Natur arrived. His black hair, red eyes, and cold expression sent a shiver down Sienna's spine. The children lined up, nervously awaiting their fate, praying for luck. Sienna was tense, silently begging for the Duke to pass her by. This time she was determined to stay unnoticed. But the Duke's footsteps grew closer, and to Sienna's horror, they stopped right in front of her. Her heart raced, trying to escape her chest. It couldn't be happening again. Yet, the Duke bent down, speaking to the astonished Sienna in a gentle voice. "Do you want to come with me to Natur Palace?" The most powerful duke in the empire, kneeling before an orphan, wanted to take her home once more. But this time, Sienna didn't want to go. She remembered all too well the pain of her previous life. After becoming an adopted child, Sienna was betrayed by her seemingly kind sister and ultimately abandoned by the Duke and his brothers. Her life ended in cold suicide. Now, in this new life, Sienna is determined not to repeat that tragedy. Duke Nature remained kneeling, waiting for her answer. A reminder from someone nearby brought Sienna back to her senses. She politely performed the appropriate gestures, though the Duke's unusual actions were beyond her expectations. Something felt different, but she still didn't want to return to that nightmarish place. Just as she considered refusing, a wave of dizziness overwhelmed her and she collapsed to the ground. The Duke looked panicked, reaching out to help her, but Sienna instinctively turned her head away before fainting. In her hazy state, she caught a glimpse of the Duke's concerned expression. "Is he worried about me?" she wondered. "How is that possible? Why would he care about me?" The war between the Empire and the monsters had never ceased, and in such a state of perpetual combat readiness, magicians had become invaluable. Nobles would adopt gifted children and even arrange marriages with them to strengthen the bloodlines of powerful magic wielders. Duke Natcher, as the adoptive father of both Sienna and Lorena, was a noble among nobles, commanding an army of magicians. Sienna remembered the first time she met her sister Lorena. At that time, Sienna had been shy and frightened, but Lorena was lively and open. Without hesitation, Lorena took Sienna's hand and said warmly, "From now on, please call me sister. I've always wanted a younger sister." Her radiant smile had drawn Sienna in, making her feel comforted. From that moment, the two had seemed inseparable. Lorena would visit Sienna every day, and they grew close like true sisters. Lorena had even invited Sienna to her home as a guest. Unlike Sienna, who was an orphan, Lorena had parents, and they welcomed Sienna with warmth and enthusiasm. The harmonious family atmosphere made Sienna feel a strange sense of comfort she had never known before. One night, Lorena brought a magic book to Sienna, excitedly asking her to try the spells with her. The eerie aura from the book made Sienna instinctively hesitate, but seeing the hopeful look on her sister's face, she couldn't refuse. Lorena explained that she wanted to share some of her magic power with Sienna, which startled her. "I have almost no magic power," Sienna admitted, turning pale. The Duke had adopted her under the assumption that she possessed magical abilities. What would happen now that the truth was out? Lorena reassured her with a smile. "I have plenty of magic power. I can share some with you." But Sienna resisted. "Wouldn't that be deceiving the Duke? I can't do that. Do you want me to go back to the orphanage?" "I don't want that either," Lorena replied. "I want us to stay sisters forever." Her words softened Sienna's resolve. She didn't want to lose the only family she had ever known, the only person who had treated her kindly. No matter the cost, Sienna wanted to remain by Lorena's side. Looking into her sister's sincere eyes, she finally agreed. "Don't worry," Lorena said with a reassuring smile. "This'll be our secret." That night, they performed the magic power transfer, a moment that would mark the beginning of Sienna's tragic fate. Her blind trust had been her undoing. Now, with the chance to relive her life, Sienna knew she had to avoid repeating the same mistakes. Despite the hardship she endured at the orphanage, she would never allow herself to be entangled with Lorena again. As Sienna slowly regained consciousness, she saw the Duke again, this time arresting the orphanage director, preparing to deal with her. The truth about her sister was now painfully clear. On the surface, Lorena appeared to be the perfect, caring sibling, but secretly, she had stolen Sienna's magic and framed her for every sin she committed. Poor Sienna hadn't known the truth until her death. All the suffering she had endured for so many years had been caused by the sister she trusted the most. Duke Natcher, observing the fainted Sienna, seemed lost in thought. "She was avoiding us," he mused, likely overwhelmed by stress. As he looked closer, he noticed Sienna's frail figure, as well as the thin, malnourished faces of the other children at the orphanage. Despite the funds that were meant to ensure the well-being of these magically gifted children, it was clear that they had been living in terrible conditions. The Duke quickly concluded that the orphanage director had embezzled the money. With a cold and commanding tone, the Duke ordered the director dismissed. The director attempted to protest, thinking it was unfair to be punished so harshly over a mere child, but the Duke's firm voice left no room for argument, and the director was dragged away. At that moment, Sienna slowly woke up, catching the Duke's gaze. His stern expression hadn't softened. "Perhaps he's decided I'm too weak," she thought. "He probably doesn't want to adopt me anymore." Taking the opportunity, Sienna clung to the teacher beside her, pretending to be weak. Desperately, she pleaded not to be taken to the Duke's palace. "I'll be obedient, I promise," she begged. "I'll just eat a little rice each day. Please let me stay at the orphanage." Noticing the Duke's growing impatience, the teacher quickly intervened, saying, "She's too young, I'll talk to her." But Sienna suddenly burst into tears, the long-suppressed resentment finally pouring out. The Duke's subordinates urged him to make a temporary concession, and with a sigh the Duke agreed. "I won't force her to go," he said, and immediately Sienna stopped crying. The Duke turned away reluctantly, leaving the teacher to hold the trembling Sienna, gently comforting her. As Sienna felt the teacher's gentle caress, she realized the bitter truth. Her older sister's sweet words and gentle smiles had hidden only malice. It wasn't until Sienna was on the brink of death that she uncovered this betrayal. Her magic had been stolen, her life trampled upon, all by the sister she had loved with all her heart. If I had stayed with the teacher in my previous life, would my life have been better? Sienna wondered. The teacher, seeing Sienna's pale face, felt her heart ache with pity and silently vowed to take good care of her in the future. Suddenly, the door was kicked open, startling both Sienna and the teacher. To their shock, it was the orphanage director. Wasn't he taken away by the Duke's men? The enraged man stormed forward, grabbing Sienna by her hair. "Damn you! I won't forgive you!" he snarled, yanking the girl's blonde hair viciously. His fury was unhinged, all because she had fainted and unwittingly exposed his abuse of the orphans. In a desperate attempt to save himself, he had spent all his money on bail, and now he was blaming Sienna for his downfall. Teacher Lisa tried to intervene, but the man struck her, sending her to the ground. As Sienna gasped for breath, feeling herself suffocating under his grip, a commanding voice cut through the chaos. "Let her go, now." Before the man could even register who had spoken, he was punched hard in the face, knocked backward. Sienna, trembling, looked up to see none other than Asil, the eldest son of Duke Nasha. Known for his calm demeanor, it was rare for him to show such anger. Father and son entered the room, watching as the director was dragged away. Sienna, still in shock, ran to hide behind teacher Lisa. Why does my life keep taking such painful turns? She felt powerless, unable to fight back. Was she destined to survive only under the Natcher family's protection? Could she ever have a life of her own? Teacher Lisa embraced Sienna, her heart aching for the frightened girl. The orphanage was no longer a safe place for her, and the Duke seemed to recognize this. He looked down at Sienna with a solemn expression. "What do you want to come with me to Natcher Palace?" he asked again, his voice gentler this time. To Sienna's surprise, there was a hint of pleading in his eyes. Is my magical talent really that valuable? She wondered. Why does he insist on adopting me, even after I've refused so many times? In her past life, Sienna had lived with the weight of guilt, believing she had stolen her sister Lorena's magic. That guilt had driven her to do everything Lorena asked, from imitating her handwriting to enduring pain just to please her. But in the end, none of it mattered. Asel had made it clear. What their family needed wasn't someone hard-working, but someone with magical power. I always did useless things, Sienna thought bitterly, and in the end, I met a tragic fate. But now, with the chance to rewrite her life, she knew she had to change her future. The orphanage might get a new director, but who could guarantee that person would be any better? And if she chose to go to Natcher Palace, she would see Lorena again in 6 months. But this time, with the memories of my past life, I can avoid being betrayed. After careful consideration, Sienna finally made her decision. She would go to the Duke's palace. Asil, who had developed a protective instinct towards Sienna after seeing her mistreated, had even offered to make her favorite teacher, Lisa, the new headmaster of the orphanage to keep her happy. But Sienna knew that her life was about to take a different path. She hesitantly agreed to become the Duke's adopted daughter. Though she couldn't bring herself to fully trust him just yet, she clung to teacher Lisa, avoiding the Duke's outstretched arms, hugging the only person who had shown her consistent kindness. Lisa gently helped Sienna into the carriage, whispering reassurances. They made a promise to each other. Lisa would visit often, and Sienna would do her best to live well and be a kind, obedient child. As the carriage made its way to the palace, the atmosphere inside was tense. Sienna sat in silence while the Duke and Asil looked out the window. The awkwardness hung heavy in the air. Sienna wondered if she should apologize to them, but then she decided she didn't want to try to act like a good child anymore. This time, she would live on her own terms. Upon arriving at the Duke's palace, Sienna had already fallen asleep. The Duke carefully carried the little girl out of the carriage, intending to place her in her new room. Asur stepped forward, offering to carry her instead, but his father refused. "Don't you have work to do?" the Duke asked, his tone firm. Asur was indeed busy, but something about leaving Sienna made him anxious. He couldn't explain why, but he didn't want to leave her side. As they entered the palace, Michael, the Duke's youngest son, ran up, curious about the little girl his father was carrying. "Is that her?" Michael asked excitedly, but the Duke quickly hushed him, scolding him for being too noisy and disturbing Sienna's sleep. Undeterred, Michael turned to his brother. "Will she stay with us forever?" he whispered. Asur nodded, giving him an affirmative answer. Michael seemed reassured by that, settling down. The Duke gently placed Sienna on the bed in her new room. Asur watched as the little girl slept soundly, noticing the unusual care and attention his father and brother were giving her. This little girl, who they had just met, was already changing the atmosphere of the household. But Asur's thoughts wandered back to Lorena, Sienna's older sister, a girl who had once driven her kind sister to her death, using cruel tricks to maintain her favored position. In her dreams, Sienna relived the horrors of her past life. She saw Lorena's furious expression as she screamed, "You stole my place! Are you happy now?" The accusation sent chills down Sienna's spine. She knew how cruel her sister could be, yet the years of oppression in her previous life made her instinctively submit, obeying her every whim. Sienna woke up with a start, her heart racing. It was only a nightmare, but the fear still lingered. As she looked around, confusion set in. This room, it looked just like Lorena's room from her previous life, the Cradle of the Moon, a lavish space filled with warmth and luxury. Why was she placed here? Despite the comfort of the room, Sienna felt uneasy. Although this was a normal room by the palace's standards, it was far better than anything she'd experienced at the orphanage, and for a moment she was grateful. But then Lorena's mocking laughter echoed in her memory. She had coveted this room, dragging Sienna there to flaunt it. "This room suits me perfectly," Lorena had boasted. "But you can sleep in the servants' quarters." In her previous life, Lorena had convinced the Duke to let her have this room, leaving Sienna to stay in the servants' quarters. The joy Sienna had briefly felt about having a new home had been snatched away in an instant. The sting of discrimination made her heart sink. Now Sienna just wanted to be far away from Lorena. The fear from her nightmare lingered, and she couldn't bear to stay in this room, worried it would cause misunderstandings or worse, stir up painful memories. She decided it was better to return to the smaller, simpler room she had been given before. As she stumbled through the dark halls, searching for her way back, Sienna tripped and scratched her leg. She bit her lip, enduring the pain, and continued onward until she finally found her old room. The bed was covered in dust, but she didn't care. It was quiet, and here at least she could sleep in peace. The next morning, Deborah, the newly appointed housekeeper, was tasked with taking care of Sienna. She was curious about the child from the orphanage. What kind of exceptional person could be placed in the prestigious Cradle of the Moon? However, when Deborah knocked on the door for a long time and received no answer, she grew concerned. She cautiously pushed the door open, only to find the room empty. The young lady had disappeared. The servants searched the entire palace from the living room to the study, but Sienna was nowhere to be found. Reluctantly, Deborah reported the situation to the Duke. His reaction was swift and furious. "How could so many people lose track of a single child?" he demanded, his voice tight with frustration. It became clear to Deborah that Sienna held a special place in the Duke's heart. She watched as he put aside his work and went to search for her personally. Meanwhile, Sienna had spent the night in the small, dusty room she had once slept in, her mind haunted by memories of her past life. Despite the warmth and comfort of the luxurious room in the Cradle of the Moon, she had fled. She couldn't bear to be associated with her sister, Lorena, who had claimed that space with her manipulative charm. Sienna wanted nothing to do with her anymore. Deborah had discovered Sienna missing early in the morning, and immediately informed the Duke. Hearing the news, the Duke hurried to find her, leading the search himself. The servants were astonished. Why was the Duke so personally invested in finding an orphan? Could there be more to her than they knew? As the search continued, the Duke had a sudden realization. It was a gut feeling, the same one he'd had the day he first met Sienna at the orphanage. Though he had never known this girl before, something about her felt profoundly familiar, as if she were his own. Following his instinct, he approached a quiet, less used part of the palace and stopped in front of a closed door. He was certain Sienna was inside, but when he entered, the room was empty. However, the bed showed signs that someone had recently been there, and the cold air was heavy with dust. The Duke's heart sank as he saw bloodstains on the dusty sheets. Is she hurt? He immediately summoned all the servants to search every corner of the palace. Just as the servants began to scatter, only Deborah remained in the room. As she stood there, the cabinet next to the wall creaked open. Deborah watched in disbelief as Sienna slowly crawled out from inside the cabinet. "Please don't tell anyone," Sienna whispered urgently, her eyes pleading. "Don't bother anyone," Sienna muttered to herself as she woke up that morning. She realized that by disappearing on her first day, she had likely caused trouble for the servants. If the Duke were to punish them, she feared they would all hate her in the future. Just as she was about to return to the Cradle of the Moon, she heard commotion outside. Panicking, she quickly hid in the closet. Later, Sienna spoke softly to Deborah. "When you take me out, just say you found me. That way the Duke won't punish the others, right?" Deborah was taken aback. "Miss, you want to help me?" she asked, surprised by Sienna's thoughtfulness, especially given how young she was. Deborah gently carried Sienna to the Duke. When the Duke saw that Sienna was safe, he let out a sigh of relief. He reached out to carry her, wanting to treat her wound. He only wanted to embrace his little girl, but Sienna flinched away from him. In her previous life, she had been slandered by her cruel older sister, and the Duke had been complicit in her downfall. That memory made her wary, even now. Seeing Sienna's resistance, the Duke withdrew his hand, his expression tense. The doctor was called in to bandage her wound and, to comfort her, offered her candy. In her past life, Sienna remembered, she only ever received medicine or care when her sister, Lorena, allowed it. The sudden attention and concern from everyone now felt strange, as if she were living in a different world. The Duke asked her, "Why did you sleep in the smaller room?" "The other room was so beautiful," Sienna explained quietly. "I didn't think it was meant for me." The Duke fell silent after hearing her response, but the servants standing nearby exchanged glances of pity. Sienna was so young, yet already so wounded by life. She looked at the Duke's expression and noticed it mirrored the same sadness she had seen in his eyes at the orphanage. He seemed to be suppressing a deep pain. Although Sienna didn't know why she had been given such a good room, she didn't want to ask. She had no desire to get too close to them. In her mind, no matter how well they treated her now, once Lorena arrived, the attention and kindness would inevitably shift back to her sister. She bowed her head and said, "I'm sorry, I won't make everyone worry like this in the future." The Duke, however, shook his head gently. "It's not your fault, and there's no need to apologize. You should know that the Cradle of the Moon is your room." But Sienna was already planning her next move. "When Lorena comes," she thought, "it's better that I give her the room voluntarily. Maybe if I do that, she won't see me as a threat. I'll move into the servants' room next to it. Perhaps then she won't be so hostile toward me." The Duke, watching her silent and withdrawn expression, felt a deep pang of sorrow. Sienna's refusal to accept the kindness she deserved only made his heart ache more. When he had last seen Sienna at the orphanage, she had been a crying, spoiled child. Now she seemed to be acting far beyond her years. Maybe she just needs time to adjust, the Duke thought. Housekeeper Deborah, however, couldn't understand this new lady. She was living in such a beautiful room, yet she complained constantly. One morning, Deborah came to bring Sienna her breakfast. When she pushed open the door, she discovered that Sienna had disappeared again. Moments later, the little girl poked her head out from the servants' room. Deborah was surprised, but Sienna nonchalantly explained, "I feel more comfortable here. Just let me stay. They'll soon forget about me, won't they?" Sienna picked up her knife and fork and began eating. Deborah observed her curiously. Despite being an orphan with no formal training, the way she ate mirrored that of a noble lady, her movements graceful and refined. There was something strange about the girl. She seemed to suffer from an odd condition. Sleeping in a large, luxurious bed brought nightmares, while only a hard, uncomfortable one allowed her to sleep peacefully. As Sienna ate, she was so tired she could barely keep her eyes open. Deborah gently helped the drowsy girl stagger back to the big bed and tucked her in. But no sooner had Sienna closed her eyes than the nightmares began. Her sister Lorina's voice echoed in her head, a constant torment that refused to leave her. Sienna jolted awake, her heart racing. She simply couldn't rest in this bed. It was cursed with nightmares. Quietly, she got up and slipped out of the room, walking past the sleeping maid. She headed straight for the servants' quarters next door. Only there, in the simplicity and discomfort, did she feel even a shred of peace. Sienna couldn't shake the bad memories from her past life, especially the fact that she had never been loved by anyone. Rumors about her began to circulate, about how she had such an eccentric personality and how it was obvious that she was the Duke's adopted daughter. The gossip spread that she didn't care about studying and only competed with the servants in their work. Some even wondered if she wanted to be Lady Lena's maid when she became a duchess. Sienna often felt the weight of her sister's false kindness. Lorena acted as if she cared, but in reality, she was always subtly mocking her, making veiled insults while pretending to be concerned. She invited Sienna to join the party but would complain if she left, saying it would make everyone uncomfortable. Then Lorena would manipulate her, constantly drilling into her mind that no one but her sister could ever love her. Sometimes, Sienna longed to escape, to get as far away from Lorena as possible. Half a year from now, when Lena would arrive, Sienna couldn't help but wonder what her sister would think if she saw the cradle of the moon occupied by her. Deborah, watching Sienna curled up in the servants' room, felt helpless. She urged the girl to spend more time in the cradle of the moon, but Sienna didn't understand. The Duke was off handling his duties, Assel was back at military school, and Michael was nowhere to be found. So why did this housekeeper cling to her so persistently? Deborah was increasingly dissatisfied with Sienna's insistence on sleeping in the servants' quarters. She chastised her, saying it was an insult to the Duke's palace. Sienna, however, snapped back. "In my previous life, I spent nearly half my life there. Aren't you insulting me by saying that?" Deborah sighed in frustration. Determined to change Sienna's mindset, Deborah tried to drag her into the sunlight, suggesting they visit the Duke's palace. It was clear that from the moment the Duke met her, he was smitten. Yet despite his affection, Sienna remained unmoved, a fact that puzzled even Deborah. When they arrived at the gallery on the second floor, Deborah eagerly prepared to introduce Sienna to the details of the palace. But just as they were about to enter, they saw Michael, the last person Sienna wanted to run into. She hesitated, unsure of what to do, before instinctively slipping behind Deborah, trying to hide from view. Michael hated shy people, so when he saw Sienna acting this way, he was sure she would leave quickly. He seemed to be holding back, sighing before telling Deborah to go ahead and that she should take Sienna on a tour. "Absolutely not," Deborah replied, but happily agreed, pushing Sienna forward and disappearing just as quickly. Sienna stood there, feeling the weight of Michael's words lingering in her ears. His voice echoed with his usual sharpness. "Why don't you greet me when you see me?" His tone wasn't friendly. He warned her, "Don't dare stay here forever." Sienna was used to these harsh words. Michael, just like in her previous life, constantly mocked her, reminding her that she was only fit for a servant's role. "Isn't it better to just leave?" she thought. She decided to follow his advice. "I think so too," she said frankly. "You can rest assured, how could an orphan like me dream of becoming Nata's child? When the time comes, I'll go to military school and won't bother you anymore." To her surprise, Michael's reaction was unexpected. He seemed genuinely taken aback. "I didn't mean to chase you away," he stammered, his earlier sharpness faltering. His response left Sienna confused and embarrassed Michael. He quickly masked his true feelings, turning to show Sienna around the showroom. "It's not like you don't like me," he seemed to say to himself, "but I can't keep my promise." Sienna, feeling helpless, simply replied, "Then I'll bother you on the go." Michael explained the tour in great detail, but Sienna found the time dragging on. She wanted to slip away quietly, but something in the display cabinet next to her caught her attention, something that felt strangely familiar, like déjà vu. Michael followed her gaze. "This is the flame of his arrows," he explained. "One of the names. Nen are creatures sealed in a box for 1,000 years. It's an ancient heritage only qualified people can conquer. There are 13 names in this world. Nata has 4, 2 of which belong to the Duke and Grand Prince Assel. One's whereabouts are unknown, and his arrows in front of us have never been conquered by humans." Sienna's mind raced as she stared at the object, her thoughts filled with the image of the girl who had been hated by everyone in her previous life. In this life, Sienna received thoughtful attention from the whole family. Even the youngest son, who always used harsh words with her, now took the initiative to show her around the palace. As Sienna gazed at the divine object before her, a strong feeling of déjà vu washed over her. It turned out that in her previous life, after her sister Lorena stole her magic power, she had touched his arrows, causing 2 powerful streams of magic to collide violently. Because of that, Lorena had been in a coma for 2 weeks, and his arrows had broken into 2 halves, mysteriously disappearing. When Lorena woke up, she became a genius who conquered the divine object and soon became famous everywhere. Sienna's mind raced. Wait. If Lorena's magic power caused the reaction with his arrows, then, if I touch it myself, will I die? Before she knew it, her hand reached out towards his arrows. "Do you want to touch it?" Michael's voice brought Sienna back to reality. She quickly apologized. "No problem. Even if you touch it, it's okay. Just stop now. It's not the right time. Think of it as a backup plan," Michael said, continuing to explain. Sienna, however, was so sleepy that she couldn't keep her eyes open. She yawned. Michael, frustrated, snapped. "It seems like you didn't hear a word I said. I'm explaining this in detail and you're yawning." He was angry enough to explode right then and there. Sienna quickly fell silent, not wanting to further upset him. Unexpectedly, housekeeper Deborah arrived with news. "The Duke has won a great victory in the raid on the demonic beasts. We're returning to the palace early today. There will be an official family party this evening, and Grandmaster Assel will attend." Sienna silently groaned. She did not want to attend the party. She tried to refuse, using the excuse that she didn't understand etiquette. But Deborah was firm. "You must go tonight. They've also said there are good things waiting for you." Sienna felt a heavy gloom in the Duke's residence tonight. In her previous life, when she first arrived here, she had been so scared she couldn't sleep. The large door slowly opened, and she saw 3 people dressed neatly and solemnly. Sienna immediately felt embarrassed. She was still wearing the clothes she brought from the orphanage. Did they do this to spite me? Is it really necessary? Even though they didn't, Sienna knew she didn't truly belong here. Her eyes caught sight of a pomegranate on the dining table. It was the symbol of the Nata family, adorned on their coat of arms. Seeing pomegranates decorating the table was no ordinary thing. It looked like tonight's party wasn't just any gathering. The Duke's palace, in all its luxury and solemnity, was hosting a grand party to welcome the appearance of an ordinary orphan. But Sienna was filled with resistance. In her previous life, she had been harmed and met a miserable end in this very place. Now, facing 3 people who had once been indifferent to her, she couldn't swallow her feelings of discomfort. "Is the food not to your taste?" Grandmaster Assel asked, noticing her gloomy demeanour. Did he notice me again? Sienna felt a pang of guilt, thinking she had offended him. She opened her mouth to apologize, but Asur looked confused. It seemed she had misunderstood his intentions. At that moment, the Duke spoke to comfort her. "You don't need to apologize. If the food doesn't suit your taste, just leave it. No need to worry about it." He immediately signaled for the butler to bring out another dish. Sienna shook her head in refusal, not wanting to trouble anyone. The Duke observed her distant attitude and began to wonder if he had acted too hastily in calling her to this place. "Let's proceed with the ceremony," he said. He ordered the servant to bring out a plate of pomegranates and instructed, "Peel the pomegranate yourself." The blood-red juice covered the Duke's hands as he carefully peeled the fruit and placed it before Sienna. Does this have any special meaning? She wondered. It turns out that this was a custom of the Nater family. When a new member joined the household, the head of the family would personally divide the pomegranates for everyone to share. "This symbolizes that the whole family can enjoy it together," the Duke explained. "The blessings are as numerous as pomegranate seeds." But in Sienna's eyes, it didn't seem like a pomegranate at all. Instead, it looked like a piece of raw meat, bleeding. The ritual felt more like gathering wild animals and dividing their prey, savage and bloody. As everyone around her enjoyed the pomegranates, Sienna hesitantly picked up a seed and put it in her mouth. The moment she did, disturbing, bloody images flooded her mind, making her feel incredibly uneasy. A chill ran down her spine, and goosebumps covered her skin. The Duke, noticing her discomfort, declared, "Sienna is now officially a member of the family." Sienna didn't understand. She was just an orphan. No matter what expectations the Duke had of her, she couldn't respond. Unexpectedly, the Duke noticed something unusual. "These are not words that a child could say," he mused. "Surely someone nearby has instigated her." Deborah, who served Sienna most closely, cried out in defense. "She is so loyal. How could she say such things? Someone must have taken advantage of my absence to speak nonsense." The Duke, however, was unmoved. "Now that the lady has eaten the pomegranate, she is officially a member of the family. Such things won't happen again." He turned to the butler, who nodded in agreement. "We will strictly manage the servants moving forward." At that moment, Deborah suggested finding a tutor for Sienna, and Asur agreed. Studying cannot be postponed. Michael, ever eager to help, offered, "Sienna can study with me." Sienna remained silent, unsure of what to say or how to feel. "In the morning he still wanted to chase me away, and now he wants to study together?" The Duke agreed and told someone to make the necessary preparations. He spoke sincerely to Sienna. "You are my recognized child of the Natwa family. Don't pay attention to those gossips. Forget it all." The poor girl, hated by everyone in her previous life, had returned to the Duke's palace after being reborn. Faced with the attention of 3 men, Sienna was extremely resistant, especially since the Duke wanted her to forget everything. She found it almost laughable. The suffering she had endured in her past life, the father and son's hatred, the trauma she had been forced to bear. How could they expect her to simply forget it all? He had said, "Forget it," so gently, but how could her wounded heart be healed by just those words? She remembered the pain, how her heart had ached to the point of suffocation. Sienna's violent reaction surprised everyone present. She couldn't stand it any longer and collapsed to the ground. The Duke quickly rushed to her side, helping her up and holding her in his arms. He called for the doctor and gently tried to comfort her, but Sienna didn't want any close contact with him. "I don't want to rely on you," she said, using all her strength to push him away. "Please, don't pay attention to me either." The Duke's pretended affection only suffocated her more. "You're treating me so well now," Sienna thought bitterly, "but will you just leave me to be tormented by you again later?" In the future, in this terrifying house, I had innocently endured all the malice and eventually died once. But now, even death has become an obsession. Do you still want me to go through it all again? Under the intense mental strain, Sienna finally passed out. The doctor who examined her said it was due to severe malnutrition combined with immense stress, which caused her to faint. The Duke blamed himself deeply. He had left the already fragile girl to face such situations on her own. While unconscious, Sienna fell into a dream. She saw her old self, haunted by the belief that she had stolen her sister's magic power. She was tormented day and night by overwhelming guilt, suffering from insomnia every night. To ease that guilt, she even competed with the servants, taking on their chores. But it was no use. The memory of exchanging magic power with her sister suffocated her. Even crying felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Lena once suggested to her, "If you want to repay the Natur family, make a talisman for Grandmaster Assel. It's an important tool to help magicians fight against evil spirits." Sienna hesitated. Her magic power was weak. Could she really do it? Still, proving her worth seemed better than just cleaning up. Full of hope, the little girl made the talisman and gave it to the man, only to later find it thrown away in a dirty corner. At that moment, Sienna was utterly devastated. Her weak magic and hands were covered in wounds from needle pricks. She had poured all her strength into proving her value, only for it to be discarded without a second thought. She recalled what Assel had said to her. "Sienna, I know you try very hard." But her efforts had been for nothing. Of course, she had been naive, believing she could be of some help. While lost in thought, she bumped into Master Michael again. The first thing out of his mouth was sarcasm. "I'm so jealous of you being so busy." He knew very well she was only fit for servant work. "Isn't it fine to just leave here?" Michael sneered. Sienna didn't want to argue, but his words grew harsher. "How could you even think about leaving? You cling to my brother every day. Are you daydreaming?" Sienna knew he misunderstood her, yet she couldn't help but wonder. Was it foolish to dream of being useful? Did she not even have the right to dream? After Michael finished speaking, he left, and Sienna woke up, startled. The painful memories of her previous life tormented her deeply. She looked around, finding herself once again in the cradle of the moon, lying in Lorena's bed. In her past life, how could anyone feel at ease here? She tried to suppress her nausea and quietly slipped out of bed, heading for the servants' room next door. Only in that small, cramped space could she feel some semblance of comfort, even if it was temporary. The next day, Michael did not calm down when he saw the scene before him. Housekeeper Deborah tried to explain that the young lady had a fever and, confused, had entered the servants' room. Michael didn't believe it. Instead of sleeping in a big, comfortable bed, she ran to sleep in the servants' bed. Does that sound reasonable? He began to doubt Deborah's intentions. Are you just pretending to be nice to Sienna in front of my father? Deborah, feeling attacked, was about to defend herself when Sienna intervened, saying, It's true, I wanted to sleep here myself. Yet Michael still couldn't understand. There were clearly better conditions. Why do you want to suffer? Sienna found his confusion ironic. In her previous life, didn't he take her suffering for granted? What was he curious about now? The girl who was despised by everyone in her past life had now become a cherished treasure, loved by the entire family. But the tragic experiences of her previous life had left her despairing of this house. The long-term oppression from her sister Lorena had crushed her self-esteem, making her feel she didn't deserve anyone's love or any good things at all. She told Michael, "The cradle of the moon room is beautiful, but this servant's room reminds me of the orphanage. That's why I sleep here." Michael, clearly frustrated, reminded her that she was now a child of the Natur family and had even eaten the pomegranates, a gesture full of deep meaning in their family. But Sienna couldn't feel that connection. She would rather have never eaten those pomegranates, wishing she could vomit at the thought. "You think I should be happy because you say we're family? Do you expect me to clap my hands in joy? How naive." Sensing the tension, Deborah stepped in and invited Michael to leave, explaining that she needed to help Sienna change her clothes. Michael, still conflicted, walked out, feeling more unsettled than ever. Sienna suddenly realized she was still in her pajamas, and here was Michael, barging into a girl's room without permission, even though she hadn't changed yet. Thinking about it, his face turned red with embarrassment. After mumbling an apology, he rushed out of the room in a fluster. Shortly after, the doctor arrived to examine Sienna. He declared she was fine, but Sienna couldn't help but feel a pang of surprise. In her previous life, the doctor had always pretended not to notice her condition, deliberately ignoring her and neglecting to treat her properly. What she didn't know was that the previous doctor had failed to detect her case of typhoid, leading to his eventual demotion. Now all the servants knew they couldn't afford to delay or neglect the care of the young lady. Deborah, surprisingly warm and gracious, served Sienna dinner. The sudden kindness felt unfamiliar, but Sienna couldn't refuse, so she obediently ate. As they shared the meal, Deborah told her that something very important had happened today. The Duke had personally invited the tailor to take measurements for Sienna, to have new clothes made just for her. Sienna was confused. Why was the Duke, who had been so cold and distant toward her in her previous life, now acting with such care and attention? The sudden change in his attitude left her puzzled, and she couldn't help but wonder what had caused it. Deborah and the tailor next door were exchanging compliments, both marvelling at Sienna's natural beauty and extraordinary temperament. But Sienna, lacking confidence, couldn't see herself that way. She felt ordinary, just a girl from an orphanage, unworthy of the praise. To her, only her radiant sister, Lorena, seemed suited for occasions like this. While Sienna was lost in her thoughts, a man suddenly walked in, carrying a large bouquet of roses. "Excuse me, is Miss here?" he asked. Sienna was startled. It was the first time she'd ever received a bouquet of roses. She could hardly believe it. "Are these really for me?" She stared at the stunning display. 999 fresh roses, vibrant and delicate. Yet, instead of feeling joy, a sense of unease washed over her. On the accompanying card, the message read, "Wishing you a quick recovery." The gift was from none other than Grandmaster Asel. The surrounding maids were practically buzzing with excitement, marvelling at the romantic gesture. "It's so romantic," they gushed. "Each of these flowers is worth a gold coin. Why are they so expensive?" Sienna, still overwhelmed, felt more apprehensive than thrilled. The grand display of wealth and affection felt suffocating, as if it carried a weight she wasn't prepared to bear. "Then why doesn't he just give me the money instead?" Sienna thought. The cost of attending military school certainly wouldn't be cheap. Suddenly she remembered something. Asel had given her flowers again. Could this have been the same misunderstanding that happened in her previous life? Did Michael think she wanted to marry Asel because of the flowers? How naive. Why would he think that? Could it have been another one of Lorena's tricks? With her deceptive ways, it was entirely possible. After all, Lorena had once tricked Sienna into stealing her magic power. But in this life, Sienna was determined not to let similar things happen again. First, Sienna asked a servant to convey her thanks to the Grandmaster. Then, she suggested sharing the flowers with everyone, explaining that back in the orphanage, gifts like these were always shared. She wanted to spread the joy with everyone present and prevent any misunderstanding with Michael. She didn't want him to think she had any ulterior motives. To her relief, Michael didn't misinterpret the gesture this time, and the servants who received the flowers were overjoyed. Their affection toward Sienna grew rapidly as they thanked her. Finally, Sienna gave the last flower and the blessing card to the tailor as a token of gratitude. In return, the tailor presented her with a sophisticated, gorgeous outfit, the most popular design of the season, and the store's treasure, representing the skill of the designer. The outfit was stunning, but Sienna couldn't help but laugh at the colour combination. "Why does it look like a chick?" she thought, trying to suppress her amusement. Housekeeper Deborah, on the other hand, was overjoyed. "With this outfit you can attend school tomorrow," she exclaimed. Sienna, however, was less enthusiastic. "I bet the tutor is still someone who hates my family," she thought. The tailor and Deborah busied themselves checking the long list of clothing: jackets, dresses, long gowns, pyjamas, evening wear and capes, a total of over 100 sets. Deborah pulled out a blank piece of paper signed by the Duke himself. "Don't worry," she assured. "Any amount of money can be paid." Sienna sighed, thinking to herself, "We just don't understand the world of the rich." The next morning, Sienna wore the gorgeous dress that Deborah had insisted on. Deborah couldn't stop praising her beauty and charm, but Sienna found the colour far too dazzling for her taste. However, when she considered how the precious gems and high-quality fabric were worth at least half a year's rent if sold, the outfit suddenly seemed much more appealing. For the first time, her heart felt lighter. Sienna pushed open the study door, expecting to meet her tutor. Instead, she saw someone unexpected. Master Michael. The young master appeared as arrogant as always, but Sienna knew he was more affectionate than he let on. Michael had skipped school just to see her. "You should study hard," he reminded her. Sienna stayed silent. "Don't you have class?" she asked coldly. "No one asked you to come here." "Well, I'm too lazy to tell you," Michael replied, trying to sound indifferent as he eyed Sienna. She quietly sat in her seat, ignoring him. His eyes lingered on her for a moment, but he still couldn't resist commenting, "I heard you bought new clothes. It doesn't look rustic anymore. If this outfit is worth half a year's rent and still looks rural, then there's a real problem." Before Sienna could respond, the tutor finally walked in. Noticing Michael, the tutor immediately bowed his head in flattery. "Is this the same tutor who bullied me in my previous life?" Sienna wondered, but she still greeted him politely. Before starting the lesson, the teacher gave them a small test, asking the children to write the letters they knew on paper. Michael began scribbling quickly, but Sienna hesitated. "In my previous life, I practiced writing relentlessly to write letters for Lorena. My handwriting was perfect, but now she was just a child. If I reveal my perfect handwriting, people will get suspicious." As she debated whether to intentionally write poorly, she realized this body had never learned to write properly, so her writing was naturally bad. Her hands kept shaking and the letters were clumsy and uneven. As Michael glanced over, he noticed her struggle and moved closer. The tutor praised Michael wholeheartedly. "Very well written. Truly our child," he exclaimed. Sienna felt a wave of shame wash over her. To be praised by a 10-year-old for something as simple as writing. What a disgrace. The tutor, however, quickly turned impatient. He slammed the paper on the table and told Sienna to practice more seriously. Just then, a man rushed into the room. It was Michael's tutor, sent to take him back to school. Seeing Sienna's subtle sigh of relief, Michael grew a bit confused. "Don't misunderstand," he said quickly. "I didn't come here because I was worried about you." He pointed at the teacher in warning. "Teach her well, and don't do anything wrong just because I'm not here." Without further explanation, the man grabbed Michael and whisked him away. As soon as they left, the tutor's flattery evaporated, replaced by a sneer. His tone shifted harshly. "An orphan, out of nowhere, dares to bother the master again," he muttered bitterly. Sienna immediately recognized him. "This is the same tutor who bullied me in my previous life. He hasn't changed at all." His insults intensified, degrading Sienna to worse than an insect. "You should just go away," he spat. But Sienna didn't flinch. In her eyes, this type of blatant malice was preferable to the suffocating hypocrisy she'd endured before. "It's the wolves in sheep's clothing that hurt the most," she thought bitterly. The tutor continued, basking in his false sense of superiority, mocking her as a mixed-race orphan. Though his words no longer frightened Sienna, she despised hearing them again. Even now, despite being an adopted daughter loved by the family, her orphan status became the target of cruel sarcasm. Sienna, in this new life, had made a firm decision. She would no longer endure such treatment. He, too, came from an orphanage, a lifetime of mediocrity, and in the end he was nothing more than a tutor for orphans like me, probably out of jealousy. As the tutor continued to rant, Sienna cut him off. "Every sentence you speak mentions orphans because orphans are your weakness," she said coolly. The tutor's face flushed with rage, his anger intensifying. He raised his hand to strike her, but before he could, an angry roar stopped him in his tracks. The Duke had appeared in the doorway, his brows furrowed and his cold eyes locked on the man. In a panic, the tutor pushed Sienna away and tried to justify his actions. "It's not what you think. Sienna insulted me first," he protested. The Duke turned to Sienna, and for a moment she felt a twinge of fear. Could it be that the Duke is misunderstanding me again, like in my previous life? But this time, Sienna was done being slandered and hurt. She couldn't let history repeat itself. Without hesitation, Sienna stepped forward and grabbed the Duke's sleeve. Her eyes were filled with sincerity, silently pleading with him to trust her. The Duke was taken aback by her actions. She still avoids me, but now she's taking a step towards me. She must have suffered a lot of frustration. The tutor still tried to deny the truth, but the Duke wasn't having it. He gave no chance for further defense. With a cold, commanding voice, he signaled for the bodyguard to step forward. The Duke, with a stern look, grabbed the tutor by the collar. "You dare disrespect the daughter of the Natter family. Prepare for the consequences." The man was dragged away, his protests fading as Sienna finally exhaled, the weight of the tension lifting from her shoulders. She watched as the Duke observed her, his gaze soft but filled with concern. I really want to comfort her, he thought, but he hesitated, unsure if his actions would only scare her more. Deciding not to rush her, he gave her space, saying only, "Rest," before turning and leaving. Sienna stood there, her mind spinning. The Duke trusts me unconditionally, but why? She couldn't let herself be swept up in the illusion of kindness. She knew all too well how fleeting such kindness could be. If it disappeared, she'd fall into the abyss again. She couldn't afford to get lost in that. Her thoughts shifted. There was something important she needed to understand. She turned to Deborah and asked, "Can you tell me more about the pomegranate ceremony? What exactly does it mean?" She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something significant about it, especially with the mention of the daughter of the Nature family by the bodyguard. But Deborah, just a servant, was not the one who could explain it. "You should ask Master Michael," she said. Just as she finished speaking, Michael burst into the room, having overheard their conversation. In her previous life, he had mocked her, but in this life, he appeared to want to protect her. When he heard Sienna was being bullied, he rushed to her side. However, before he could speak, Deborah scolded him sharply. Michael recoiled, quickly retreating to knock on the door again, this time lowering his head in apology. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced with genuine concern as he defended Sienna with a fierce expression. "I'm amazed," Michael said, his voice filled with emotion. "If I had been there that day, I would have protected you." Deborah, moved to tears by his words, was left speechless, while Sienna, though appreciative, felt a deep sense of helplessness. She didn't want to owe him anything. What she didn't expect, however, was that Michael had made a decision on his own, and the Duke had agreed. From now on, Sienna would study alongside him. The news was truly shocking to her. She had to be forced to study with him again, someone she didn't want to interact with. When Michael saw her awkward expression, he quickly tried to reassure her, thinking she was simply embarrassed. "Don't worry, you don't have to be afraid of me," he said kindly. But Michael hadn't yet realized that Sienna was someone who valued patience above all else and wouldn't allow herself to be overwhelmed by others' expectations. The Duke, too, was more cautious now. He encouraged Sienna, urging her to prove herself. "Don't let anyone look down on you just because you're an orphan," he said. But to Sienna, proving herself didn't matter. She didn't want to build a foundation in a place that could easily be swept away. She refused to place her trust in something so fragile that a small misstep could leave her drowning in uncertainty. Whether others despised her or not didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. Michael, however, didn't understand her indifference. He only saw her hesitation and thought she needed more encouragement. He dragged her to school with him, certain that pushing her was the answer. At school, Michael's tutor, Seth, greeted them with politeness and a humble demeanour. Sienna immediately recognised her as the same tutor who had accompanied Michael to school previously. but now Seth was smiling warmly, seeming eager to teach. When Seth mentioned starting with magic lessons, Sienna hesitated and raised her hand. "I don't know how to write," she confessed. Her previous tutor had insisted she practice more, but Sienna wasn't sure how to begin. To her surprise, Seth dismissed her concern. "Don't worry about basic writing for now. You'll be taught by another tutor. We'll focus on magic, and you'll learn the writing naturally," she explained, making the subject seem trivial. "But," Michael leaned in, his voice low, "don't be fooled by her gentle appearance. She'll make you study relentlessly, and you'll be practicing like crazy in no time." Sienna couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. Michael was right to warn her. Though Seth seemed kind now, she knew how quickly things could change. After hearing Seth's words, Sienna felt a surge of happiness. She bowed her head and thanked her, deeply grateful to finally have a dedicated tutor. This would be invaluable for her future at military school. Seth, taken aback, couldn't quite believe it herself. Perhaps she had finally found a good student. On the first day of school, Sienna's attitude of attentively listening to the lectures, so focused that she even forgot to eat or sleep, impressed Seth deeply. After years of teaching, she had finally encountered a student who truly cared. Even though Sienna still struggled with writing, she took notes diligently, which only fueled Seth's enthusiasm for teaching her. Seth lectured on the principles and stability of magic, delving into the specialized field of magical therapy, which is a highly professional skill among magicians. They covered half of the book in one session and even assigned homework. When Seth asked Sienna if the lesson was difficult, Sienna's confident response made her even more certain. This was a rare student. This was the first time in both of Sienna's lifetimes that she had officially learned magic. Unlike her previous life, where her magic power was stolen by Lorena, this time she was free to develop her abilities. This new beginning was her opportunity, and she was determined to seize it as she prepared for her future at Theoban Military School. Meanwhile, Grandmaster Assel stood by the window, gazing into the distance. A pigeon carrying a letter landed in his hand, and he carefully read its contents. Lately, he had been receiving letters from home. His friends had been inquiring about what was going on there, but Assel had remained silent, offering no updates. As he turned to leave, it seemed he was preparing to return home this weekend to the Natcha district. Back at school, Michael had heard that Sienna had been working on her homework non-stop for 3 days. He admired her dedication, remarking that he had absolutely no academic talent compared to her. But Sienna couldn't help but wonder why Michael was pretending to be modest. It was clear to her that he wasn't as lacking in talent as he made it seem. After entering military school, Sienna always aimed to maintain the top position, pushing herself to understand every sentence. But, despite the challenges, she felt immense joy in learning. She enjoyed the independent process of studying, even though her hands were calloused from the constant writing. Deborah also noticed the change in Sienna. Once quiet and withdrawn, she now exuded enthusiasm when studying. However, this change also made Deborah feel a tinge of sadness. She suggested that Sienna take a break and go for a walk in the garden. At that moment, Assel returned. The butler, well aware of why the Grand Master came home every weekend, noticed him heading upstairs. He kindly reminded Assel, "If you intend to visit the ladies' room, you may be making an unnecessary trip. These days she's always in the study room, focusing on her studies." Assel realized, only then, that his instinct had led him to go upstairs to see Sienna. He hadn't meant to, but his body moved of its own accord. Known for his reason and perfection, Assel found himself losing control when it came to Sienna. When he first met her, special feelings had begun to form, but her eyes, filled with disgust and rejection, quickly reminded him of his past actions in her previous life. In that life, Assel had trampled on her feelings, and now Sienna naturally avoided him. Assel, with no memories of the previous life, assumed his strong presence had scared her and decided against seeing her, wanting to respect her space. The housekeeper, knowing how much Assel cared about Sienna, explained, Every day, you ask about the lady's well-being, sending letters and flowers, especially when she was sick. But why don't you go see her yourself? You'll know for sure if she's doing well." Determined to check on her, Asel went to the study room, but Sienna was out. He looked around, his eyes scanning the room to ensure she wasn't being mistreated. Seeing the study room, where Asel had spent time as a child, he tried to find a sense of connection, running his hand over the table and chairs they had both used. Just then, something under the table caught his attention. He leaned down in surprise. It was unbelievable. There, under the table, was the wilted rose he had given Sienna again. Asel tried to convince himself that it was just a normal gift with no deeper meaning, something easily forgotten. But why did his heart ache so much? Deborah, witnessing the scene, was also taken aback. As she opened her mouth to explain, Asel turned around and quickly left, leaving behind a simple command: "Don't tell Sienna I was here." One last glance at the wilted rose under the table triggered a familiar image in Asel's mind. The emotions in his eyes were mixed, and he couldn't shake the feeling of déjà vu. It was as if he had experienced this moment before. Meanwhile, Sienna returned from the garden, noticing the servants rushing around in a frenzy. Michael informed her that a letter had arrived from Count Gia's palace. The Count's daughter was challenging Sienna for the ownership of Jaros, a sacred object that helped humans fight against demonic beasts. Sienna recalled that Jaros was the very insurance she had planned to use as a last-minute escape. Since Jaros still had no official owner, all magicians were eligible to compete for it. In her previous life, Count Gia had always remained neutral, seeking only practical benefits. But now, something had changed. Why had she suddenly taken action in a way she never had before? Sienna realized the reason. It was her. She was the variable that could change both the past and the present. The Countess must have seen how much Asel cared for an orphan like her and become jealous. She believed her daughter was better suited to the role and had long coveted Sienna's position. This sentiment mirrored Sienna's thoughts in her previous life, when, after a dispute with Larina, she had tragically taken her own life. The position of guardian of the Duke of Natta's residence was not just about noble status, it was also tied to Asel the Grand Master, who many considered the ideal husband. Countess Gia, like so many others, coveted that position. Although there was no official rule stating the guardian must marry the Grand Master, it was widely assumed. Once Sienna had become the adopted daughter of the Natta family, she had entered a realm where many powerful figures had their eyes on her. She would definitely become Asel's wife, Asel thought, unable to stop himself from laughing at the absurdity of it all. But, according to the regulations, he couldn't stop the Count's daughter from challenging Sienna. In his heart, however, Sienna was the only one he truly saw. At that moment, Sienna was struggling to reach books on the top shelf. With the announcement that Count Jin's daughter would be coming, the entire palace was in a flurry of preparations. Every servant had been assigned a task, and even Deborah, the new servant who had been assigned to help her, was nowhere to be found. No one offered to help Sienna. Sienna did it herself. After all, she had experienced similar situations in her previous life. The books, however, were packed too tightly, and as she tried to reach for one, she accidentally fell to the ground. After a moment of noise, she suddenly realized that her surroundings were eerily quiet. Had she become so accustomed to being surrounded and cared for by people that she now felt sorry for herself? She could only force herself to focus, telling herself to concentrate on learning magic. She understood better than anyone how to deceive herself when her heart was hurting. Meanwhile, the servants in the palace were busy preparing to welcome Count Jin's daughter, leaving Sienna alone once again, with no attention paid to her. The girl was hungry and had to find food herself. Relying on her memories from her past life, she made her way to the kitchen, hoping to get some bread to eat. It was there that she unexpectedly met Grand Master Asel standing at the door. He was surprised to see her in the kitchen. Sienna explained that she was simply hungry. Asel, concerned, asked, "Could it be that the housekeeper doesn't prepare food for you?" Sienna quietly explained that since the lady was very busy, another servant had been assigned to take care of her. Assel's expression darkened when he asked, "So where did that servant go? Why are you in the kitchen alone?" The more Assel thought about it, the angrier he became. It was clear that the servants had intentionally ignored Sienna, and the fact that she knew where the kitchen was showed that this situation had likely happened often before. Sienna, enduring yet another frustration, avoided Assel's outstretched hand when he attempted to comfort her. In her previous life, Sienna had believed that Assel didn't hate her because he was simply cold toward everyone. She had given him the most amulets, hoping that he would at least acknowledge her efforts. But instead, his cold words crushed her hope. "Sienna, your efforts are worthless." Sienna begged Assel not to scold others because of her. She also refused his offer to take her back to her room. Just then, the butler arrived. Assel instructed the housekeeper to take good care of Sienna and deal with the irresponsible servants. As he watched the little girl leave, Assel couldn't help but remember the look in Sienna's eyes. It wasn't just fear. There was also caution and distance. Later that afternoon, the people from Count Jar's mansion finally arrived. Isabel, the Count's daughter, had bright red hair. As soon as she met Assel, she deliberately showed politeness, thanking him for responding to her sudden request. The Count was also by her side, complimenting his daughter's perfection. Assel saw through the deceit between mother and son, but out of politeness he still invited them into the palace. "My God, I've been invited to the natural residence for dinner again. It feels like I'm dreaming," Isabel exclaimed to herself. But Michael, who was with her, found her behavior too flamboyant and couldn't help rolling his eyes. The two brothers, though aware of the Count's real intentions, competing for the position of Sienna's adopted daughter, still maintained a polite attitude and played along with the act. Once everyone entered the hall, Assel was surprised to see Sienna waiting there, looking neat and composed. Michael, without hesitation, abandoned Isabel and rushed over to Sienna. "No need for formalities," he said, enthusiastically talking non-stop. Assel noticed their closeness and felt a slight discomfort. "Are you two really that close?" Assel asked, his voice betraying his unease. He then introduced Sienna to Isabel and the Count, saying, "This is the adopted daughter of the Nature family." Isabel stared at Sienna with hostility in her eyes. "Is this the orphan who is pampered by the natural family as rumoured?" The adopted child, once despised by everyone in her previous life, had now become the family's treasure. The Duke's affection for Sienna made others jealous, and Isabel, the Count's daughter, wanted to claim that position for herself. The Countess, too, seemed intent on making things difficult for Sienna. She immediately asked for the girl's last name. Sienna could sense the ill intentions behind the question. "I'm an orphan, so I don't have one," she replied calmly. Michael, angered by the blatant attempt to provoke Sienna, was about to say something, but the Countess raised her glass of wine, smoothly changing the topic. "Thank you, Grandmaster, for your thoughtful hospitality." Isabel, trying to charm Assel, cast a shy expression toward him, but Assel only responded with polite, distant sentences. Meanwhile, Michael enthusiastically introduced the dishes to Sienna, happy to see her appetite improving. It was a small relief to Assel, who couldn't help but feel a twinge of jealousy seeing the two of them so close. However, Isabel couldn't contain her jealousy for long. "How lucky you are," she sneered, her anger barely contained. "No one has ever enjoyed such an honour." Her eyes glared at Sienna, filled with bitterness. Sienna, accustomed to such hostile words, remained unflinching. "I am very grateful for the Duke's grace," she said calmly. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Isabel was taken aback by Sienna's composed response, finding it odd for such a seemingly ordinary child to speak with the calmness of an adult. Sienna, however, hadn't expected her simple words would have such an impact. She felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that one word from her had made Isabel retreat. Compared to Lorena, who was skilled in manipulation and deceit, Sienna still had a lot to learn, but for now, she was content with this small victory. Sienna sighed helplessly, but Isabel misunderstood her reaction, thinking she was laughing at her. "Insolent child!" Isabel sneered. "You think you're worthy, don't you? It's clear that only I am fit to be the Duke's adopted daughter." Isabel's words were laced with arrogance, and she made sure Sienna could see her contempt. Then, with an air of superiority, Isabel invited Sienna to challenge her for the possession of Hisar the next day. The room went silent in shock. Even the Countess hadn't anticipated such a bold move from her daughter. Isabel explained her reasoning, her tone dripping with false humility. "Since I'm the adopted daughter recognized by the Duke, I must surely be more talented than her. If we eliminate her, it would be unsatisfactory for me to participate myself. Whether it's me or this orphan, neither of us is likely to succeed, but everyone will see that I'm more talented than her. Let her be humiliated in front of everyone." Sienna's eyes gleamed with intrigue. Things are getting interesting. The challenge for the Hisar artifact could be her chance to escape the tragic fate of her past life. Isabel, eager to usurp the pampered position, was trying to humiliate her in front of everyone to show she was the superior candidate. But Sienna saw an opportunity to turn the tables. Master Michael, however, was beside himself with worry. He jumped up, frantic. "What if Sienna fails and Isabel succeeds?" he fretted. "Then she'll definitely claim she's more worthy of being the Duke's adopted daughter. What if she takes Sienna back to the orphanage and takes her place?" His fears were clear, but Sienna's resolve remained steady. She wasn't going to let this opportunity slip by without taking action. Sienna's indifferent attitude drove Michael crazy. "What do you mean, let's go back to the orphanage?" he exclaimed. "Do you really think we would just abandon you like that? You're already part of our family." His voice was filled with frustration and disbelief. Sienna remained calm, her expression unreadable. Michael, clearly distressed, continued, "You've already eaten the pomegranate. That can't be undone." Sienna paused, processing his words. It turned out that in the Natur district, only those who were officially recognized could receive the pomegranate. It wasn't just a fruit, it was a type of magic, a custom that allowed individuals without Natur bloodline to live safely in the Natur mansion, protected by powerful barriers. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. The pomegranate magic would bind her to the Nature family, making her as much a part of their bloodline as anyone else, and that bond could never be broken. Sienna's heart pounded loudly in her chest. That means I'll be tied to this place for the rest of my life. The weight of the realization settled heavily on her, and for the first time, she wondered if the cost of safety and belonging was too high. Sienna's mind raced as she realized the gravity of her situation. If Isabel succeeded in taking the position of adopted daughter of the natural family, her place in this world would be entirely upended. The challenge for the ownership of Hisar seemed more daunting with every passing second, but Sienna's resolve remained unwavering. Meanwhile, Isabel, sitting nervously in the room, began to regret her hasty request. She could sense the tension in the air. The great prince Assel seemed uncertain whether Sienna would even agree to the challenge, and that uncertainty gnawed at Isabel. What if Sienna actually won? The thought unsettled her deeply. Michael, on the other hand, was panicking. He couldn't stand the thought of Sienna entering the challenge, especially given the potential risks. "What if she fails?" he asked, his voice full of worry. But the Countess, with a calm yet commanding presence, stepped in. She interrupted Michael's panicked ramblings and reassured him with a cool smile. "Don't worry. You and that orphan are different. I have a mother, and I've already made arrangements with the housekeeper. I will make sure you become the future Duchess." Assel, still clearly anxious, shared his own concerns. What if something goes wrong in the challenge? What if someone gets caught in an inextricable situation? His worry was palpable as he looked at the butler, hoping for reassurance. The butler, ever composed, responded, "Both ladies will fail in the challenge. Nothing will happen." But his words did little to ease Assel's concerns. He was still haunted by the thought that Sienna might face complications. "How do you assess her talent?" Assel asked, his gaze fixed on the butler. "Before she was taught, could you make any judgments?" The butler hesitated. Only the Duke could make a preliminary assessment, but with him away on the battlefield, we cannot afford to make hasty decisions. Asel weighed the options, the pressure mounting. If we let the challenge proceed, it could bring nothing but trouble. The Count's mansion won't ignore this situation. But Sienna, she will be subjected to so much criticism. I can't let her go through this. Despite his hesitation, Asel's mind was set. I want to protect her. I love her. His voice was firm with determination, but there was an underlying fear of what could happen if Sienna entered the contest. Michael burst in, pleading for help, but his words fell on deaf ears as Sienna's determined eyes met Asel's. "Great Prince, I want to fight for Hizar," she declared, her voice resolute. Asel immediately refused, shaking his head. "Fighting for Hizar is not easy," he explained. "Only trained individuals can compete." Sienna, however, wasn't deterred. "But I don't need training," she said, confusion tinging her voice. Asel's anger flared. He looked at Seth, who had been silent up until now. "What is this?" he snapped. "Sienna doesn't need training?" Seth, ever the diplomat, stepped in to advise. "All magicians have the right to compete for Hizar. Sienna is no exception." Michael, already on edge, exploded with impatience. "Why does everyone defend her?" he muttered under his breath, his frustration mounting. Sienna stood her ground. "If Isabel succeeds in this challenge, I will fight for Hizar," she said firmly, her resolve clear. The tension in the room hung heavy, but Sienna was determined to take the steps necessary to prove her worth, even if it meant facing the challenges ahead. Asel was stunned by Sienna's calm demeanour. "So you think we'll just abandon you?" he thought, confused by her words. His mind raced. Did she feel she didn't belong in the nature family? Despite all the care and consideration they had shown her, Asel couldn't help but wonder if he could ever erase the unhappiness in her heart. In the end, the Great Master softened and agreed to let Sienna participate in the competition. He couldn't bring himself to prevent her from trying to prove her worth. Sienna returned to her room, feeling satisfied with the outcome. As she walked in, she saw the new servant preparing an abundant meal, clearly expecting her to eat. The sight of so much food piled in front of her made Sienna feel pressured. She turned around quickly, running away from the overwhelming display. She hid behind a tree in the garden, wanting to escape the unwanted attention. Since the previous servant had been let go, the new servant was clearly worried about her hunger and tried to push food on her. But Sienna wasn't interested. Just then, Isabel appeared, her voice sharp and filled with disdain. "Why do you still have the audacity to stay in this household?" Isabel sneered. "Even I wouldn't dare raise my head here. How can we expect an orphan to understand integrity?" Sienna couldn't understand the venom in Isabel's words. In her previous life, the Count's mansion hadn't cared about her at all. Now, Isabel was deliberately trying to provoke her. But Sienna knew she wasn't strong enough to retaliate. Instead, she smiled slightly, her calm demeanour only adding to Isabel's anger. Isabel seethed, her voice rising. "How dare you laugh? The position of the Duke's adopted daughter is for people who are qualified. You're nothing but trash." Sienna, undeterred, looked at Isabel with a touch of admiration. "I also think so," she said, her tone surprisingly sincere. "So I support you in taking this position." Isabel blinked, momentarily thrown off. "Of course you must support me," she said smugly, but then she paused, confused by Sienna's words. "Wait, what did you say?" Sienna's smile remained. "I support you unconditionally. I sincerely wish you win." Her words were laced with a subtle challenge, and Isabel couldn't tell if Sienna was mocking her or genuinely wishing her success. Either way, the tension between them thickened, leaving Isabel fuming while Sienna remained unfazed. Isabel stood frozen, her hand still hanging in the air as the fan she had been holding fell to the ground. Sienna, without hesitation, picked it up and handed it back to her, holding her hand for a brief moment. "Please, take my place," Sienna said softly, her eyes sincere. "I will wholeheartedly support you." Isabel was completely stunned, her mind racing. This was not how she had imagined things would go. What is this kid even doing? She wondered, speechless. Sienna returned to her room, feeling a strange calmness after the encounter. Michael soon came to report that the Duke had returned early. He added that they still had to welcome the Count and his mother once more. Sienna felt a headache coming on. Do I have to go there again? She thought. She didn't want to deal with it. To avoid the situation, Sienna pretended to cough, feigning illness. Michael, ever the concerned servant, immediately asked her what was wrong. Sienna, as if explaining herself, mentioned that she had caught a cold while walking in the garden. Michael, deeply worried, quickly placed his hand on her forehead to check for a fever. Seeing his face so close to hers made Sienna blush, but she didn't show it. "You're not in the mood to eat or drink anything, right?" Michael asked gently. Sienna was surprised by how well he understood her. She wasn't in the mood for anything at all. "I also really want to chase them away," Michael continued, his tone sympathetic, "but with my status in the Natal Palace, I can't do it on a whim. But Father is back tomorrow, and it will all end then." As he spoke, he gently stroked her hair, his expression soft and approving. "You're so lovely," he said, praising her. Sienna was stunned by this unexpected tenderness. She stood frozen, unsure of how to respond, until Michael left the room. As the door closed behind him, she finally regained her composure, a strange shiver running down her spine. Who would have thought a 10-year-old child would act like that? She thought to herself, feeling unsettled. The next morning, Sienna woke up with an odd feeling. It was an important day, but no one had come to wake her up. She got out of bed and tried to open the door, only to find it locked. "Someone is trying to stop me from participating in the competition," she realized with a sigh. An old trick? Having faced similar situations in her previous life, Sienna lay back down on the bed and waited. She was determined to see if anyone would come to open the door and try to stop her. She wasn't going to let anyone get in her way this time. A moment later, housekeeper Deborah's call rang out, and finally the door opened. Seeing Sienna lying on the bed, Deborah felt a mix of worry and impatience. The young lady was sound asleep again, locked in without asking for help, even planning to sleep in. Sienna honestly admitted, "No one came to help me." Deborah, feeling resentful, asked, "Did you think I was bored by you so you didn't need to be saved?" Sienna remained silent, urging her to quickly prepare as she was about to leave. "Everyone's waiting impatiently," Deborah grumbled, complaining under her breath. Michael was a bit worried, wondering if something had happened to Sienna. Meanwhile, the Earl and his mother exchanged a triumphant glance. Finally, Sienna and Deborah arrived, only to face harsh criticism. Deborah immediately knelt down and apologized, explaining to the Duke why Sienna was late. "Mrs. late because of the guests present today. It's the great day of the struggle for Jaros, but the girl was delayed." The Countess, concerned, asked, "Which guest could it be? We don't usually entertain guests like that." Deborah explained that it had been her responsibility to care for the guests these past few days. She had assigned another servant to look after the young lady, but unfortunately Sienna had been neglected and hadn't been fed. Hearing that his daughter had been mistreated, the Duke became furious. "How dare they treat Sienna so cruelly?" he demanded. Whispers spread throughout the room, and people began to murmur in sympathy. Letting such a frail child go hungry was unthinkable, and everyone began to feel sorry for Sienna. Deborah continued, "Miss is late because the new servant locked her in her room." She confessed it had been done on the Countess's orders to prevent Sienna from joining the competition. Deborah also mentioned that the Countess promised the servant 100 gold coins if the plan succeeded. Feeling exposed, the Countess's wife quickly denied the accusation. "How could we do such an evil thing? Are you claiming the housekeeper is slandering us?" The Duke's cold gaze silenced her, and the Countess flinched under his stare. At that moment, the priest presiding over the ceremony spoke up. "The competition cannot be cancelled. Let the ceremony begin." As the tension simmered, Asel added, "After the fight, there will still be penalties. If you fail, the consequences will be even more dire. Even if Isabel wins and becomes the owner of the Nater name, she will still be prosecuted to the end. Isabel, hearing the Duke's resolute stance, began to feel a twinge of fear. The Countess, noticing her unease, tried to console her. You just need to show that you're stronger than that orphan. Everything will be easily resolved. Isabel nodded, trying to calm herself. I just need to prove I'm stronger than her. Everyone will forget how they treated her and reevaluate me. With a sharp glance, Isabel approached Sienna and whispered fiercely, Just like you. You dare challenge me? Sienna, confused, replied innocently, I made no attempt to participate in the challenge. Didn't you invite me? The moment Sienna finished speaking, Isabel's anger boiled over. Her eyes were filled with darkness and malice. Sienna flinched, startled by the intensity of Isabel's glare. At this point, the showdown began. The magician announced the rules of the game. The Jaro artifact would choose its owner. If you were refused, you would have to bear the consequences. Once you became the owner of the name, it meant you had achieved the honor of being the protector of humanity, a title that would never change. Isabel, looking nervous, stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the holy water jar containing the Jaro artifact. The Countess, equally anxious, held her breath. As Isabel reached out to place her hand in the jar, a powerful force immediately pushed her back. The challenge was over. She had failed. The Countess was stunned. Let me try again, she begged, despite Isabel's warnings. She placed her hand in the jar once more, but this time a stronger force knocked her to the ground. Both mother and daughter were defeated, their hopes dashed. The consequences of arrogance, combined with failure, were severe. They would now have to face punishment for their attempt to harm Sienna. Now it was Sienna's turn to challenge the Jaro artifact. Asel and Michael watched with extreme concern. Sienna took a deep breath and slowly placed her hand into the holy water jar. There was silence. Nothing happened. It seemed that in her previous life, Lorena had been harmed after touching the Jaro artifact because she had 2 streams of magic power in her body. Now, with only 1 stream, nothing occurred. Sienna felt a twinge of disappointment but was relieved. Just as she was about to withdraw her hand, a voice suddenly rang in her ears. Don't go, the voice echoed again. Sienna looked around, but no one reacted. Maybe she had heard wrong. It seemed like she had failed the challenge after all. What are you talking about? You didn't fail, the voice rang out again. Sienna hesitated, then responded, Could this be his arrows? That's right. For 2,000 years I have been waiting for you, my first master. Sienna, overwhelmed, withdrew her hand and turned to leave. She just wanted to be a normal person. Someone who could eat and sleep well, without the burden of being the protector of humanity. She wasn't ready for such responsibility. She lied, claiming her hand hurt and that she had failed the challenge. However, his arrows seemed to easily ignore her. Suddenly, the gem in the water leapt up, glowing with a brilliant fire. Sienna heard a fierce roar. I told you not to go! The sacred fire exploded violently, and everyone in the room was stunned. Asel and Michael moved forward to help, but the Duke held them back. Wait. Fiery snakes surged towards Sienna. The fire surrounded her, but instead of burning, it didn't feel hot at all. The intense flames shrank down into a small, controlled flame. This was his arrows. Sienna wanted to give up, thinking again, I never said I wanted to be your master. A mocking laugh echoed. Do you think I have enough free time to ask for your opinion? I'm not the first destiny you've met. Don't compare me to others. Sienna felt confused. She had never met another fate she didn't understand. The voice, taunting her, continued, Why don't you want to sign a contract with me? You know you don't want to be my master. Sienna opened her mouth to explain, but her vision began to blur. Her body weakened, and she lost consciousness. The divine artifact that others coveted, the girl dodged again, only because she wanted to live a normal life. Yet, as she struggled with his arrows, she fainted. It was then revealed that the new mage relies on instinct to cast their first spell. This moment of enlightenment could determine the direction of their magical future. Based on the scale and trend of her magic, it was clear. Sienna's future lay in evolution. She would become an excellent healing magician. Everyone congratulated the Duke. After all, healing magicians were incredibly valuable. They could rescue others from evil spirits. But what surprised them even more was Sienna. Not only had she dispelled the evil spirit that had lingered in the Natar Palace for years, something no other healing magician had been able to do, but her evolving powers brought even more magic. She even summoned spring in the midst of cold winter, bringing life where there had been none. It was unforgettable. "Let Sienna rest," the Duke told everyone, signalling them to retreat. There was still the trial of the Count and his mother to prepare for. Once everyone had left, the Duke turned to Sienna and told her to open her eyes. It turned out there had been too many people watching, and Sienna, ever sensitive, had avoided opening them. The Duke understood, giving her the space she needed. Alone, Sienna couldn't help but sigh. This time it's completely over. The thought of her life's end felt overwhelming. "What's the end of life?" His arrow's voice rang out, jumping into the conversation with a tone of complaint. The small flame stretched, waving and smiling with satisfaction. "At last! I don't have to hide as a necklace anymore." Sienna, feeling frustrated, muttered, "I signed a contract alone after making someone else faint. It's so forced." His arrows grumbled in response. "You put your hand into the water of evolution. That's an ancient custom for signing contracts. You did it yourself, meaning you asked to sign the contract. I agreed to your request. This is a fair and public signing ceremony." "There's no backing out now." Sienna knew there was no point in arguing. She immediately changed the subject, asking, "What does the Nacho Evolution Palace mean?" The small flame glowed with pride. "This is my gift to you. Surprised? You should be. I've performed such powerful magic. From now on, no one would dare rob her again." But Sienna had a headache. She didn't want to stand out like this. Despite the strong magical powers in this life, she didn't want all the attention. She just wanted a simple, quiet life. His arrows, in the form of a fire, weakened slightly. "Are you planning to leave me?" "Don't even dream of it. You and I are in an eternal contract. I'm doing this for your own good." Sienna didn't even know that those infected by the evil spirits were dangerously close. She responded, realizing the truth. "It turns out the Count and his mother have changed their personalities and committed many evil acts. As expected, it's connected to those dark auras." At that moment, the two criminals, the Count and his mother, were kneeling on the ground, trembling. They couldn't understand why they had done such cruel things. The powerful Duke Nater stood over them with an expressionless face. The Earl and his mother, once proud and arrogant, now cowered, kneeling in fear for daring to harm the Duke's pampered adopted daughter. Now they faced the Duke's judgment. The Count, still confused, thought, "Why did I suddenly become so stupid? Why did I harm others? What made me do such things?" But when they saw the fire of his arrows, the realization hit them. Their bodies were definitely affected, but it was too late now. The Duke had the right to execute them. "No matter how you explain it, it's useless," the Duke said coldly. The Countess, desperate, begged the Duke. "This was all caused by me alone." Isabel, unaware of the full situation, also pleaded with the Duke to spare her life, but the Duke had no intention of showing mercy. He wanted to use their deaths as a warning. Nature would show no mercy to any criminal. The cold blade reflected the woman's desperate face. "Spare your life," the Duke muttered. At that moment, Sienna arrived at the scene. Assel was surprised to see her. "Why did the bodyguard let the lady come here?" Sienna explained calmly. "I came by myself. Please don't scold the servant." After hearing this, Assel didn't say anything further. This response surprised everyone present. As expected, Sienna was the master of his arrows, making the others listen in awe. The Duke took back his sword, his cold eyes turning to Sienna. The look in his eyes reminded her of her previous life. The fake older sister Lorena, who had falsely accused Sienna, making everyone believe she used evil magic to harm her. No matter how much Sienna tried to explain, the Duke had locked her in prison. The Duke's gentle voice broke through Sienna's thoughts, pulling her back to reality. "What's wrong?" Sienna tried to calm herself before speaking. His arrows told her that the Earl and his mother had been invaded by evil spirits, which was why they had acted the way they did. As soon as she spoke these words, murmurs rippled through the crowd. "No wonder their actions were so unusual," someone whispered. "Without Sienna's intervention, I'm afraid the evil spirits would have fully taken over, and they would have gone mad." It turned out that his arrow's words were highly trustworthy. At that moment, Asura asked Sienna, "Why did you save the Earl and his mother? The noble adopted daughter was almost murdered, yet you prevented the execution of criminals at the last minute. I don't understand." Though the Earl and his mother were influenced by evil spirits and did bad things, they still threatened you. Why save them? Sienna replied calmly, "I'm not here to save them, and I don't have that ability either. I just don't think we should hide the truth. As for how they should be handled, it's not up to an orphan like me to decide. That's for the Duke to decide." The Duke pondered for a moment before delivering a new verdict. He decided that the Earl and his mother would have to give Sienna half of the mining shares from the Count's palace as compensation for damages. It was a lenient punishment. The Count's palace, in turn, expressed gratitude to Sienna for her actions. Isabel, recalling Sienna's life-saving intervention, vowed, "I will repay this favour." Sienna glanced at the share contract, her eyes widening. It turned out the mine wasn't just about ordinary gems. It also contained gem essences that could create magic. These essences could be used to engrave cleansing spells or make powerful amulets, making the mine extremely valuable. Sienna hesitated, not wanting to accept it. "It's too expensive," she thought. In her previous life, this mine had belonged to Isabel, and she had lost it to Lorena in an underground fight. Now, compensation for Lorena's loss had placed this massive fortune in Sienna's hands. She feared that accepting it might lead to disaster. Asura, sensing her reluctance, advised, "You should take it. This is an inseparable asset for the magician who owns the name. Perhaps the Duke or Grand Master could accept it for you?" At that moment, the Duke suddenly stood up, his gaze fixed on Sienna. "You are no longer an orphan," he said sincerely. "You are the owner of the name Jaros. With that title comes great privilege, but also great responsibility." His words hit Sienna hard, leaving her feeling an immense sense of pressure. Sienna was taken aback by the Duke's words. "So, Sienna, if you still want to give up your responsibility, then just leave," he said calmly. "We can live as we please. You don't have to care about other people's opinions. The freedom that Nasha guarantees you, even I cannot violate it. So from now on, don't say you're an orphan anymore. Nasha will always be behind you." Sienna was utterly surprised. The Duke's expression was sincere, and there was even a hint of mercy in his tone. For a moment she was stunned. It seemed that the things from her past life were not meant to happen in this one. She was the only one bound by those memories. Could she really forget the unforgettable pains of her past? Could she begin a new life calmly, without those haunting memories? She couldn't do it. There was no apology or remorse for what had happened. She couldn't forgive easily. She would rather carry those memories with her for the rest of her life. Although the Earl's government had compensated her, it wasn't over yet. Before she could focus on that, Deborah had discovered a bottle of poison that could temporarily suppress magical powers. The origins of this drug were unclear, just as the source of the evil spirits affecting the Count and his mother remained a mystery. Everything needed to be thoroughly investigated. Late at night, Michael found himself in a familiar room. A man was pacing nervously in front of him, muttering curses. "This is so arrogant. Doesn't even want to see him. I don't understand why my father brought that child to the palace." Michael sat frozen in the chair, unable to move. Who is that person? He wondered. The man turned around, and when Michael saw his face, he was shocked to realize that it was himself. He woke up startled, realizing he had just dreamt about his future. He broke out in a cold sweat. Who is the person I hate so much in my dream? And who is the girl who keeps flashing in my mind? Seth, meanwhile, congratulated Sienna on becoming a healing mage. "Thank you for bringing spring to my palace. Even though I didn't see that moment myself, I feel the blessing. I'm very happy." Seth looked at Sienna, feeling reassured by her growth. He also secretly admired the Duke's wise decision. Before that, someone had suggested that the Duke hold a victory party and publicly reveal Sienna's identity as a healing mage. However, the Duke chose to keep it a secret. He explained that Sienna wasn't used to being recognized as Natcha's daughter, and he forbade any outsiders from making contact with her. The nobles who had hoped to use her position to climb higher in society were worried. With the Duke pampering Sienna so much, how would they find opportunities to flatter her? But the Duke didn't make it difficult for them. Instead, he provided all sorts of extravagant gifts: toys, books, and treasures gilded with gold and inlaid with pearls. These were all gifts from the nobility. However, the Duke insisted that they be returned. At the time, Seth didn't fully understand, but now, seeing Sienna's smile, he realized that the Duke had wanted to protect her. His actions had been thoughtfully planned out. Since Sienna had become a healing mage, she would be required to attend military school once she turned 14. So, Seth began teaching her the basics. This was exactly what Sienna had been hoping for. She eagerly took notes as Seth explained the principles of shamanic healing. Seeing how attentively Sienna listened to the lecture, Seth decided not to assign homework. However, to his surprise, Sienna was a bit disappointed. "Actually, doing homework is quite interesting," she admitted. This was the first time Seth had ever heard a student speak so positively about assignments. It was as if the great master had accidentally exposed a weakness in his own teaching approach. Forced to teach, Seth's tiring and painful career as a mentor began. But now, with a student like Sienna, diligent and eager to learn, his once gloomy life was finally beginning to shine with hope. Miss Sienna is a great student, Seth thought, touched by her hard-working spirit. She truly was an angel. One person was attracted by the wit and humour in the teacher's teaching style. The harmonious teacher-student relationship was simply adorable. "Okay, what homework do you want, miss?" "As long as it's assigned by the teacher, any assignment is fine." Just then, Michael walked in and saw this scene. "Are you two crazy? Should we invite a doctor to take a look at both of you?" he joked. Deborah smiled. The two of them are just very passionate about knowledge. This was Michael's first time seeing Sienna smile so happily. At mealtime, Sienna often lost interest in studying and would start to feel sleepy. Michael couldn't help but remind her, "Stay awake. After eating, we're going out." This woke Sienna up immediately. "Let's go shopping on the street," she said. In their previous life, at the orphanage, the headmaster was afraid they would cause trouble, so he didn't allow them to go out. In Natcha, there were only days off, and she had only gone out a few times with Lurna. Seeing Michael's mischievous smile, Sienna felt that if she agreed, it would be like losing a battle. She noticed his smile, and then, suddenly, something flashed in Michael's mind. He vaguely remembered a scene from the past, a girl lying there quietly. It was the same girl, harmed by her cruel sister and dying unjustly. "I thought I could finally escape a life of not being loved by anyone," he thought.